what has been clearly proven to be a government cover-up. Story 1. During the Bush administration, there was a conspiracy that the government had warrantless wiretapping on everyone's cell phones and was listening to anyone they wanted to at any time. Of course, this was illegal and cell providers could be sued into non-existence if they allowed this. It turned out to be true, and AT&T and Verizon were sued to the point of being destroyed as a result. Bish bailed them out by lying and saying the law simply didn't apply due to national security. Story 2. Flint water crisis. The first class action was led by 3 people who died in mysterious ways, including the whistleblower that worked for the water plant. We were lied to about whether the water had rained for a long time. Millions of dollars were never used for the water. There were cases and cases of water just stuck inside of abandoned schools. And no one went to jail despite everyone acknowledging that they knew the water was tainted. I should also mention that a lot of the children affected were also not given the special needs accommodations that they now needed, because the school system refused to test them, and the doctor's offices were overrun with people concerned about their children. The second set of lawsuits have been won, but there have not been any payouts. For years, Trump released $100 million, then promptly banned the EPA from saying anything else. The infrastructure cost $1.5 billion to fix. After that, he simply raised the levels of hazardous things allowed in water. Now they are saying the water crisis is solved. Story 3. Rocketdyne nuclear meltdown in Simi Valley. Truly a wild story. Essentially, they tested a sodium reactor here. It melted down and they told no one. All right on the edge of Los Angeles. My dad grew up in Simi Valley and only learned of this in the 90s. It contaminated local groundwater and everything. I always remember him telling stories of being in school and having all the windows rattle. Well, it was the 1960s and 1970s, so everyone's first thought is this it? Did the Soviets just nuke us? Then, when there wasn't a mushroom cloud, everyone collectively breathed a sigh of relief and went, "Oh, just Rocketdyne testing crap again," and went on with their days. That is deeply unsettling, but also sadly not surprising, given how much Cold War-era experimentation happened under a veil of secrecy. The Rocketdyne nuclear meltdown, also known as the 1959 Santa Susana Field Laboratory (SSFL) accident, is one of the worst nuclear accidents in U.S. history, and yet barely anyone outside California has even heard of it. The fact that it happened so close to Los Angeles and that it was covered up for decades is chilling. And no containment building? That's just insane by today's standards. Story 4. Pat Tillman was a professional football player who left his football career with the NFL to join the U.S. Army in May of 2002, following the wake of 9/11. Tillman's decision to join the military was co-opted widely by the Army for recruitment and advertising, as well as being covered extensively by the media. However, as Tillman's service continued, he grew jaded with the war effort and no longer believed the United States to be in the right. Tillman recorded this in his wartime journal and at some point began making arrangements to meet and converse with Noam Chomsky upon his return from overseas. On April 22, 2004, it was reported that Pat Tillman was killed in action. The actual cause was not initially reported by Army authorities, even to Tillman's family, until weeks later. A report described in the Washington Post on May 4, 2005, prepared at the request of Tillman's family by Brigadier General Gary M. Jones, revealed that in the days immediately following Tillman's death, Army investigators were aware that Tillman had been ended by friendly fire, shot 3 times in the head at less than 10 yards away, according to Army doctors. Jones reported that senior Army commanders, including General John Abizaid, knew of this fact within days of the shooting, but nevertheless approved the awarding of the Silver Star, Purple Heart, and a posthumous promotion to the rank of corporal. Story 5. The U.S. funded terrorist insurgencies in the Middle East so they'd fight the Russians and keep them busy, while America tried to gain more control in other regions, like SE Asia. The U.S. orchestrated 40-plus regime changes, coups, assassinations of heads of state, overthrows of democratically elected leaders, terrorist insurgencies, etc. in Central and South America, all to keep the regions destabilized, maintain control influence, and prevent any possibility of successful socialist or communist nations providing fuel to anti-capitalist movements or groups in the U.S. Story 6: Roswell, New Mexico weather balloon crash. This is old before my time, but it was a big one. And Area 51 in Nevada was created to deal with the remains of that crash. It was widely believed, and correctly, so that the general public would not be prepared to handle the truth. The army guy who discovered the actual wreckage was given all sorts of medication and later written off as crazy years later. Remember, Area 51 was created because of this. Area 51 was created to test new, top-secret aircraft designs. That's why Lockheed Skunk Works primarily operated from there. All the wacky cancers people got were likely from the chemicals associated with much of the early work on stealth tech. Most other bases are near large population centers, so there's a much higher possibility of those dang Soviet spies seeing our brand new airplanes we're going to use to spy on them. Story 7. Secret Service agent George Hickey Jr. firing the third and final round during the shooting of JFK. The Warren Commission lied, saying there was only one rifle present that day, Oswald's, before someone published a video of the shooting showing Hickey holding and then dropping an AR-15 right as the final round was fired into JFK's skull, a round which was far too small to have come from a 6.8 Carcano. The president's guards were hung over from partying the night before, leading to a new agent negligently shooting the president. After he was already mortally wounded, Congress covered it up. Story 8. U.S. involvement in the British Governor-General's dismissal of Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam in the 70s. Edit. For our younger Australians who might not know of his work, here is a bunch of things that Whitlam implemented, some of which still exist today. Medibank, the precursor to our Medicare system, free tertiary education for all, the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, maternity leave, no-fault divorce, a blanket ban on drilling in the Great Barrier Reef, abolishing armed forces conscription, establishing free legal aid for all, reopening diplomatic relations with China, establishing the Australian Schools Commission, equal pay for women, increases in unemployment benefits and funding for the arts. And he proudly declared himself a socialist. I beg of the Australian kids today, find yourselves a new Whitlam and make them PM again. Story 9 in U.S. v. Reynolds. 3 widows sued the government in 1953 for the accident report on the airplane crash, which ended their husbands. They claimed that the report would prove the crash was caused by negligent maintenance, entitling them to damages. The government claimed that the report could not be released because it contained sensitive military information. The court accepted this argument and refused to release the report. This is the origin and basis of the state secrets privilege. The report was finally declassified in 1996. It did prove that the government was negligent in maintaining the airplane and that the widows should have gotten their damages. It did not contain any sensitive military information. The entire basis of the state secrets privilege was nothing but a lie to screw some innocent civilians out of damages they were rightfully owed. Nonetheless, the SSP continues to be asserted and accepted in courts to this day. There is no telling how many of these assertions are yet more lies. Story 10: 500 broken treaties with the original people of this continent. The 500 broken treaties with the tribes, 567 federally recognized. The theft of Mount Rushmore and the Black Hills. All the coups started in Central America and recently in South America, and the overthrowing of governments for corporate gain and profits, just causing thousands of more indigenous people. Genocide. Monroe Doctrine, the theft of Hawaii. All this is documented, but to speak the ugly truth is frowned upon. Story 11. In the 1940s and 1950s, before we really knew about the repercussions and long-term effects of being exposed to radiation, the U.S. government on Runit Island in the Pacific tested nuclear weapons. In the aftermath of the tests, they had men build a concrete dome over the craters of the detonations, without being told what they were working on, and lacked any protective equipment. All of the men that worked on that dome over the years have died from cancer and other illnesses relating to the radiation. The U.S. government still denies these men died from being exposed to radiation and never compensated the families of the ones who have died. That's horrifying. And it's one of those stories that perfectly illustrates how negligence, secrecy, and a total disregard for human life were baked into much of the early nuclear era. Runit Island and the infamous Cactus Dome, sometimes called the nuclear coffin, is a tragic monument to that recklessness. The US conducted dozens of nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands, displacing entire communities, irradiating land and water, and leaving a legacy of suffering that continues to this day. The dome itself was a stopgap solution, essentially a giant concrete cap over radioactive waste, plutonium, and debris. And it's already cracking. Story 12, so, back in 1959. Have you ever heard of the Dyatlov Pass incident in Russia? A group of 9 experienced hikers set out on an expedition in the Ural Mountains, but none of them made it back. When search teams found their bodies, the scene was straight out of a horror movie. Some were found with missing eyes, one with a missing tongue, others with their skulls and chests crushed, yet no external wounds. Their tent was ripped open from the inside like they were fleeing something in total panic. Radiation was found on their clothes, and to this day, no one can fully explain what happened. The Soviet government quickly closed the case, blaming it on natural forces. But rumors started swirling about secret military tests, maybe even weapons experiments. And here's the kicker. When independent investigators tried to dig deeper, the authorities suddenly lost key documents. They almost buried the whole thing. The best explanation is that there was a shift in the snow. It's a type of avalanche, I can't remember the name, which caused them to believe it was an avalanche. So they quickly left the tent and headed for the trees where they'd be safer. But because they left so quickly, they weren't dressed appropriately. And hypothermia helpfully leads to people undressing. They believe the ones who lived longer took their dead friends' clothes to have a better chance of survival. But ultimately, they all died. The no external wounds statement is weird because the crushed skull was due to a fall, and head trauma doesn't always need a big wound to be deadly. The eyes and tongues missing is the least weird part because that's what animals eat first, as it's nice and soft. Story 13. I read an Area 51 book based largely on interviews from ex-employees there from back in the day. They talked a lot about the weird nuclear crap they did there and a lot about the spy planes and secret programs, but the book got to a place where he wouldn't talk anymore about. He basically said, like, those human experiments the Germans were doing that were so horrific. Like, we were doing that stuff too. But even now, in my old age, I won't tell you about it. Every time the author brought it up, he was like, no, I don't even want to think about it. So that stuff never really saw the light of day, so I guess they did get away with it. It's like the moon landing, it would definitely have been easier to fake. I'm not sure either way, but Russia never called the US out about it. Because they were lying and faking stuff too. It would have just been a can of worms. Story 14. With all the flavorful branding and whitewashing of trauma, the US DoD does and has provided funding for Agent Orange, Charlie, Normandy, Patriot Act, Artichokes, Cult 45, ISIS, Marvel, etc. Is anyone surprised that they had a program known in the military for the source of all media, Fire from the Gods? They use this program across generations to describe what the future would look like. They've also used this apparatus to destabilize elections, murder civilians, and terrorize communities with the peak technology of the internet era, the ability to hear someone's thoughts through technology. This mark of the beast was pre-planned and widespread, with intention to force and live through an actual apocalyptic scenario, derived from the teenage media visionary and linked with Norse mythology for reference point. Story 15. MK Ultra. Many people have heard of it, but just assume it's just an old conspiracy theory promoted by hippies and don't bother looking into it. The CIA really did spend 30 years and millions of dollars experimenting on mostly unwitting people with LSD and other drugs because they were trying to develop mind control techniques to use in espionage. None of it worked, though. Most of the docs have been declassified, and you can read all about it. The program was very extensive, and some of the experiments they did were unbelievably messed up. Many subjects died, others went insane. MK Ultra is one of those historical facts that, if you didn't know better, would sound like some far-fetched tinfoil hat conspiracy, but it's all real. The US government, through the CIA, literally drugged and psychologically destroyed people for decades in an attempt to create methods of mind control and interrogation. And yes, most of it was done without consent, under total secrecy, and often with devastating consequences. Story 16. This is kind of related, but back in the 50s, the US CIA had a spy plane, U-2, that would fly on the edge of our atmosphere around 70,000 feet. The pilot actually had to wear a spacesuit. It was thrust into the public when the Russians shot one down in 1960. It just blows my mind that there are still countries in the world that have not come close to reaching space. But the CIA had a plane 60 years ago that could fly at that height, and it was completely secret. In 2013, they released a declassified packet of information explaining that Area 51 was largely used as a U-2 testing and pilot training ground. It makes me wonder what kind of crap they have now that is still kept secret. Story 17. Not from the US government, but from their Korean ally. Bodo League massacre. The South Korean government imprisoned up to 200,000 suspected communist sympathizers, and even people who had no connection at all but were added to fill a quota. At the start of the war, hindered them from doing covert operations. When the war looked lost before the UN troops landed, they all were executed. That includes 12 to 14-year-old girls. The US, British, and Australian governments were informed about this, but it was a secret in South Korea up to the 90s. And even today, that's not something widely known. Story 18. Area 51 was or is an experimental airbase. The reason they guard it so closely isn't because of aliens, but rather that it's the place where we test very sensitive aircraft and similar things that have the potential to change warfare to a fundamental level. The SR-71 was developed there and tested many times. We also tried to develop a flying saucer. There's a video that shows someone driving a floating circular disc that Hitler had also tried to develop. They didn't go through with it because the scientists decided that the time would be wasted to try and make an actual high-altitude one. They declassified this a good bit ago, but people are too focused on the alien aspect that they don't care. Personally, I think the government would go to these extremes for technology that allows us to spy on our enemies and allies almost undetected much faster than they would for little green dude. Story 19. That the US government from World War II to the mid-1970s funded an ESP project that involved using remote viewing to gather intelligence data. While information gathered by teams of remote viewers were found to be accurate, the US government denies that any of it was ever deemed useful for intelligence purposes. I am very late, but the truth to this is way more awesome and funny. We had a psychic and ESP program because the Soviets had one. The Soviets, from my understanding, weren't doing it in a serious manner. They were dumping money and bullcrap resources into it so the US would put more money and more resources into theirs and waste their time. We would do the same thing with technology, building crazy crap that would never fly and making it look like a jet prototype, then leaving it on an airbase for a Soviet spy plane to catch. Story 20. Project Thor is an idea for a weapons system that launches kinetic projectiles from Earth's orbit to damage targets on the ground. Jerry Pournelle originated the concept while working in operations research at Boeing in the 1950s before becoming a science fiction writer. The system most often described is an orbiting tungsten telephone pole with small fins and a computer in the back for guidance. The system described in the 2003 United States Air Force report was that of 20-foot long, 6.1 meters, 1-foot diameter, 0.30 meters tungsten rods that are satellite-controlled and have global strike capability, with impact speeds of Mach 10. The time between deorbiting and impact would only be a few minutes, and depending on the orbits and positions in the orbits, the system would have a worldwide range. There is no requirement to deploy missiles, aircraft, or other vehicles. Although the SALT II, 1979, prohibited the deployment of orbital weapons of mass destruction, it did not prohibit the deployment of conventional weapons. The system is not prohibited by either the Outer Space Treaty or the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Some systems are quoted as having the yield of a small tactical nuclear bomb. Story 21. From some flying magazine, the SR-71 was introduced in 1966, at a time in which commercial aircraft were pretty much limited to 25000 to 30000 feet altitude maximum. There was a very junior air traffic controller, bored out of his mind, minding an ATC center somewhere in the heartland. Now, he frequently handled unscheduled changes in altitude. Pilots would call them in, and he'd routinely grant the change. This evening, he gets a call. Northfield ATC, this is Rainbird 27, requesting altitude 50,000. Controller. Okay, Rainbird 27, if you can get up to 50000, you can have it. Rainbird 27. Roger that, descending to 50K. Thanks and good night. Story 22. The U.S. Army SL-1 nuclear accident. The SL-1 was a low-power test reactor in Idaho. They shut the reactor down for the holidays. On January 3, 1961, 3 guys went in to power it back up after coming back from vacation. Part of the startup required they reconnect the control rods to the mechanism that raises and lowers them in the pile. To do this, they needed to manually raise the rods a few inches. Read, grab the rod assembly by hand and lift it. For some reason which isn't clear, the reactor operator who was lifting one of the rods suddenly lifted one of them almost 2 feet too far, probably because it was stuck, and he was prying and pulling hard on it and it broke free. This caused the reactor to immediately go critical and superheat the coolant water, causing a steam explosion and blasting the shield plugs out of the top of the reactor. Also not clear is why the shift supervisor was standing on top of the reactor at the time. He was found impaled by one of the shield plugs in the concrete ceiling of the reactor room. The explosion ended the operator instantly. The third participant survived the blast and was found in the reactor room by rescuers but later succumbed to his injuries. The reactor melted down. The site was buried and abandoned. Story 23. Fun fact about MK Ultra. In the late 50s and early 60s, one of the head professors of psychology at Harvard decided to conduct an experiment on the school's brightest and most talented students. The purpose of the experiment was to observe and document what happens when you stress, bully, and overwhelm persons with high IQs. The students were publicly berated, even mocked by various professors participating in the program, and fundamental ideologies were questioned and even attacked. Christians were exposed to logical flaws in the Bible. Atheists were challenged to explain the root of some of the most basic and mysterious components of the universe. Liberals were assaulted as weak and naive. Conservatives attacked for being greedy. Even the students' friends and family were fair game. The program was sponsored and overseen by the CIA and managed by Dr. Henry Murray. It began in 1959 and was scrapped in 1962. Dr. Murray was quite candid about his experiments after they concluded. One of the students who was an unwilling and unaware test subject was, wait for it, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Story 24. There actually were chemical weapons found in Iraq during the First and Second Gulf War, which resulted in Saddam's execution. The government was too embarrassed to admit it at the time because it helped in the production of those chemical weapons. Can confirm. In Al-Qut, we were one of the first units to arrive. In some of the bunkers on the airfield, we found shells that set off all the chemical detectors. We immediately backed out and called the special frequency we were supposed to call. Other government agency people in desert fatigues with no identifying marks showed up in Blackhawks. Trucks showed up a little while later. Everything was loaded and carted out, and our commander was told the report he filed didn't exist. And he'd better make sure it remained that way. The shells had English or French writing on them, depending on which bunker they came from. Our NBC NCO said they all appeared to be old sarin gas shells, which would have been inert by that point in time. Story 25. Area 51. Tested MiGs, stealth tech, used it to evaluate U.S. recon satellites and screw around with the Ruskies. In the early days of the web, I stumbled across Glenn Campbell's Desert Rat newsletter. In the early issues, he's just a run-of-the-mill Western libertarian cowboy who hates the BLM and wants to hike up to peek at Area 51 from the vantage points in BLM land. He details cat-and-mouse games with BLM officers and insignia-less military security dudes that remind a reader of an Edward Abbey novel. At some point, either he goes crazy or the military starts putting drugs in his Cheerios because mostly out of the blue, it abruptly shifts to alien autopsy, black helicopter la la land and becomes both unreadable and incomprehensible. It's sad because you can see the reasonable, clever person who wrote the earlier issues just disappeared.